Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
We end today's show by looking at a leaked FBI counterterrorism memo, which claims so-called black identity extremists pose a threat to law enforcement. That's according to Foreign Policy magazine, which obtained the document written by the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Analysis Unit. The memo was dated August 3rd, 2017, only days before the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where white supremacists, Ku Klux Klan members, neo-Nazis killed an anti-racist protester. Heather Heyer injured dozens more. But the report is not concerned with the violent threat of white supremacists. Instead, the memo reads, the FBI assesses it's very likely black identity extremist perceptions of police brutality against African Americans spurred an increase in premeditated retaliatory lethal violence against law enforcement and will very likely serve as justification for such violence, end quote. Civil liberties groups have slammed the FBI report, warning the black identity extremist designation threatens the rights of protesters with Black Lives Matter and other groups. Many have also compared the memo to the FBI's covert COINTELPRO program of the 50s through 70s, which targeted the civil rights movement. For more, we're going to San Francisco, California, where we're joined by Malkia Cyril. She's the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Media Justice, as well as a Black Lives Matter Bay Area activist. Malkia, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you talk about this report and what your assessment is of this term they have used, black identity extremist?
Well, thanks for having me. It's a great question. What is a black identity extremist? I think we're all trying to figure that out. Nobody knows, in part because it doesn't exist. It's a term fabricated by the FBI, constructed, and it has a history. I mean, for a very long time, for many decades in this country, probably centuries, the FBI has criminalized black dissent. We saw it through the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, as you mentioned, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. We're seeing it again today. This term, this idea of black extremism coming up by the FBI, being used as a way to criminalize democratically protected speech and activity. It's wrong, it's erroneous, and it should be withdrawn.
So what is your understanding of where it stands now?
Right now, we don't know. I mean, that's part of the problem. We need some information from the FBI. It's clear that the FBI should provide an unredacted description. What do they mean by a black identity extremist? Right now, that description is pretty vague. It refers to some anti-white ideologies. It compares, it talks about ideologies of black separatism, but it doesn't have anything concrete. I mean, I think that's part of the problem, that this is a categorization that has been constructed. The definition makes no sense, and we need some more information from the FBI so that we can actually respond effectively to this categorization.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T. Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Sunday, November 5th, 2017. So I have been told. Thanks everyone for tuning into the broadcast. That audio segment that you just heard, that was from Democracy Now!, my BFF, Amy Goodman. We will hear from her again before we wrap things up. Certainly, we and many others have been discussing the FBI's report on the Black Identity Extremists and their threat. For us, the timing to be talking about this on today, when it's reported that a shooter opened fire at a church right outside San Antonio, Texas, leaving approximately 24 fatalities, other injuries. This is all still rapidly unfolding, but the suspected shooter, the photos and images that they've shown thus far, this looks like another individual who could be classified as white. Not sure. Maybe he also is a black identity extremist, but just keep that in context as we continue the discussion. As soon as myself and many others began talking about the FBI report that was released just a few weeks ago, I immediately thought it would be great because we spent a lot of time on this broadcast discussing the COINTELPRO campaign against black people. We've had many authors on the program over the years. William Pepper and his work on the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. We had Dr. Kenneth O'Reilly on the program, his book, Racial Matters, the FBI Secret File on Black Americans from 1960 to 1972. And one of the first books that I thought of, the FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black leaders. Very important. I think anyone who is going to participate, devote time and energy to working against racism, to know the type of response you are likely to encounter. And particularly given the recent report, thought it would be great to get more information, especially from someone who's done a lot of research on the COINTELPRO campaign. Our guest, in addition to writing the FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, he also wrote Drugs as a Weapon Against Us. And these two books link. And I want to make sure we get in a few questions pertaining to that book and his work by trade as an addiction counselor. Always a pleasure to have him on the program. Really appreciate his scholarship. Joining us live, his third time on the cows, Mr. John Potash. Mr. Potash, are you with us, sir?
Yeah. Hey, Gus. Thanks for having me on again. You can just call me John. It's easier.
Will do. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of your time with us this evening. I want to hop right to it and encourage listeners, if you have a question, I see Red, formerly in Ohio, now in Nevada. If you have a question you want to ask Mr. John Potash, go ahead and get a hand up early. We'll only have him for about an hour or so, so do not dilly-dally or lag. Go ahead and get a hand up if you have a question. I also wanted to make sure I got in. I read Mr. Potash's, I've read both of his books, but I read the FBI War on Tupac Shakur. It was a while ago, and I actually got one of the first edition copies. Through the course of life, my copy got switched around, so I ended up getting a different later edition copy, and I saw that we got a shout-out in the later edition copy of the FBI War on Tupac Shakur, so much obliged.
You're welcome.
To start off, and folks can go back in the archives and get more detail. We spent the whole program talking about your first book in the title, FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders. Why did you use the term war to describe the COINTEL program and this attack that you document that went on for decades?
Well, it's just a very literal war. It's a covert war, but they were killing, our great black leaders. They were killing leftist leaders in general, but were particularly brutal in the targeting of black leaders. And, they were using all kinds of means of sabotage, but murder was just one of many means to sabotage any progressive black movements to, help the black community and to help all of us, really. I argue. I mean, Martin Luther King was advancing the needs of poor people in general, and not just black people. But he was particularly, good about his, incredible about his civil rights work, as was Malcolm X, and as was a number of the other leaders I talk about, which were the Black Panther leaders, and they were all. I mean, the evidence that they were all gunned down. A number of these black leaders, like the head of the Los Angeles Black Panthers, different other black, Fred Hampton, the Chicago Black Panther leader, And then into the 90s with the assassination, I argue, of Tupac Shakur, because he had been head of the New African Panthers, which was active in 8 to 10 cities when he was 18 years old before he became a rapper. But when he became a rapper, he only hid his activism behind this gangsta facade in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them in line with his Black Panther extended family that was doing that across the country. So this is, a very literal war. They call it low intensity warfare is some of their terms in their documents, but this is our battle, and it's in my second book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, I show how some of these tactics were done against a number of white leaders also, and I actually argue that it was any leftist leaders, but the war is just particularly brutal because of their particularly intense racism of the oligarchs, against black progressive leaders, leftist leaders, I argue. But it's gruesome, it's continuing, and was he swearing in, an FBI counterintelligence program agent blew the whistle on the program and said that it's been continuing in the 1990s at least under different names than COINTELPRO, than the counterintelligence program. They just changed the names. And this is what, a number of whistleblowers have argued that they did with a number of their programs. The CIA was linking Operation Chaos with, the counterintelligence program, and MKUltra, the MKUltra project, which is the kind of focus of my book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, linked up with the COINTELPRO to target these leftist leaders. Mm-hmm. So, so this is it's just a very literal war, and I'm glad they caught this FBI document, but it just shows in black and white what they have continued up until now, which is this counterintelligence program under different names.
Context of White Supremacy. Before I ask more specific questions about the Black Identity Extremist report, one other aspect of the COINTELPRO program, yes, it did evolve plots to assassinate individuals. You mentioned Fred Hampton in Chicago, Mark Clark, Bunchy Carter as well, many other folks, Dr. Martin Luther King, we had William Pepper on the program, even Mr. Swearingen has been a guest on the program back in 2009. But not just assassinations and jailings and what have you. A big part of that program also involved discrediting Black people or anybody that was looking to work against what I call the system of racism, white supremacy. And that would include, and you include a lot of information about this, planting false information in major newspaper reports or magazines, just circulating false information so that people would think, oh, these are not folks with a legitimate grievance, people that are trying to do quality work, establish justice work against racism. These folks are, some thugs or some hoodlums or something illegitimate, someone or something that we should not support. And this week, there was a lot of attention on the JFK files that President Trump released. And, oh, wow, we're going to get some new information. And somehow this went from files on the assassination of the president to, oh, man, that no good Martin Luther King Jr. was a cheating, womanizing. He might have been Harvey Weinstein of the 1960s. And I looked at that and I said, I've heard in a lot of different books, it's in Ralph Abernathy's biography. He was a comrade of Dr. King. This is a Black person, Ralph Abernathy, that Dr. King had an affair. It's in Ava DuVernay's film on Selva. It comes up, his extramarital affairs. If all of this is going back to an FBI file, if nobody has any hard proof, if this is all just what was a part of the COINTELPRO campaign against someone who is a high-level target in the war of white supremacy, Dr. King, how much validity do we put on these allegations of him being this adulterer?
No doubt. There's really we really should put very little validity on it. It's because Earl Caldwell was a New York Times reporter in 1968 when he was just shocked to hear his editor tell him that his assignment was to go down to Memphis and to nail King, to write a smear article on him, just to basically get anything he can just to make him look bad. And that's basically the way the press was handling Dr. King. Was they were working with the FBI to try to make him look bad in any way they could either document or make up, is what they usually did. And that's what was going on. And so Hoover was making up all kinds of things about MLK, and this is in their own documents. You could even find places where they were trying to find ways to paint him as something that he wasn't. So yeah, there's really they do this to a number of black leaders, and even black cultural leaders like black musicians. They smeared Jimi Hendrix in a huge way when he started to turn into an activist. And when he died abruptly, and I argue he was killed by his manager actually admitted to at least two people. His manager was Mike Jeffries. Had said he was former MI6, and I show the evidence that he continued to be MI6, which is British CIA. And he basically admitted to having Jimi Hendrix killed. And so with Jimi Hendrix, they tried to make him out to be this sex-crazed guy, this drug-crazed guy who was using heroin and using acid like crazy, when that's just very far from the truth, according to his top biographers. And so, they had a long FBI file on Jimi Hendrix because he was so influential. But they've done it to all black leaders. I'm sure, they were trying to smear Malcolm X also, in different ways before they assassinated him. And so this is their modus operandi. And so it is surprising that some substantial writers or activists would take these FBI files seriously when they say Martha King was involved in an orgy or something like that. It's most likely not true. It's most likely made up by Hoover and his men.
You, in the FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, you have a whole chapter where you talk about killings happening at a specific time. Dr. King being killed a year to the day of him making a public speech against the Vietnam War. You argue similar circumstances with the killing of Huey P. Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther Party. When myself, and I might be a little bit ahead, but with this information coming about Dr. King, we are about 4 or 5 months away from the 50-year anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, and having just went through the 50-year anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X, and I saw that did get a lot of attention, and there were a lot of seminars and talking about him. These people have already been talked about a lot over the last 5 years with Black Lives Matter and connecting it to their struggle, as they say. Am I reaching to say that you might be seeing more of this? Oh, Dr. King, he had all those affairs and orgies as we get closer to the 50-year anniversary, to make sure it's not just, wow, they killed him 50 years ago, and how much have things changed, and continuing his struggle to divert some of that to, oh man, he was a womanizer. It's not that much difference between him and Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah, no, I think it's a common tactic. Now, I really don't know Dr. King's sex life, and I really don't care, to be honest, but I would lean towards it being made up by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The key is that one big anniversary is when they come in the spotlight again, they try to smear these great leaders again, and that's what they've done. That's what they continue to do. And so Martin Luther King, you brought up the fact that Martin Luther King was killed in the exact year anniversary of him, making that famous speech in New York against the Vietnam War. And William Pepper, his close friend and political ally, and the King family's lawyer later in the 1990s, said in his book that it doesn't appear to be a coincidence that exactly on the exact 1 year anniversary of King's speech, he's assassinated. And I argue that in my second book, I argue that's because he was the first, or really the most prominent black leader to come out at that time against the Vietnam War. Of course, Malcolm X came out against the Vietnam War very early. And I argue that's part of the reason they assassinated, Malcolm X too. The oligarchs are drug traffickers. That's one of their biggest trades. I mean, besides being genocidal racists, they're major drug traffickers. That's the way they make a lot of their money. It's also the way they control us, by spreading drugs through our communities. And when the Vietnam War was over a obscure little area in Southeast Asia, what was the significance? The significance was it was around the Golden Triangle for producing, poppy fields, which produced opium and heroin. And that's why that was the longest war of its time. And then the next longest war that actually surpassed the Vietnam War in length was the Afghanistan War, and which is the area of what they call the Golden Crescent for poppy fields, and while the Vietnam area is called the Golden Triangle for producing poppy fields. And so, that's part of the reason, of course, besides just Martin Luther King's great activism, great leadership, great movements for the masses, for 99% of us who are trying to make, who like society to be better versus the 1%, they say, of course, of the wealthiest. And I think they are going to smear him again, though, on the 50th anniversary. I think you're right. That's what they tend to do. And the anniversary, whenever anyone else comes back in the limelight, some of our progressive great leaders, they smear them in some way or another. And they distort their history. They constantly just focus on Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream versus all his other great causes, too. So,
Context of White Supremacy, our guest, John Potash, with the Black Identity Extremists report specifically, and you touched on this already somewhat with the COINTELPRO campaign, and many of our other guests who've been on the program, Dr. O'Reilly as well, pointed out that they used FBI agents, local enforcement agencies, different groups enforcing the system of white supremacy. They used a lot of these tactics against many individuals, but it seems that the worst, the most vile tactics were reserved for black people. And one thing that I think is really important with the Black Identity Extremist report, I scoff at the term blacks and Latinos or black and brown people. I don't use that phrase. I even encourage folks to not use the phrase. I didn't hear or read brown identity extremists. I didn't read or see or hear Latino identity extremists or black and brown identity extremists. It was black identity extremists. And I think that's really important in terms of not lumping in all quote unquote people of color or just everybody in as though everyone's treated the same when that is clearly not the case. Your response, Mr. Potash?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's incredible. I mean, just the shooting of black people en masse by police for apparently no reason. I mean, a traffic stop and they're shooting someone. Someone running from a police officer shooting him in the back. I mean, this is just constant. There's how many? I think I read in 2015 alone there was over 100 unarmed shootings of black people. I think in if I'm not mistaken, well, I can't remember if this is actually just Baltimore or if it was the country in general. But either way, if it's the country in general, over 100 unarmed blacks shot by police and killed by police. It's just, it's genocidal numbers, and in 1 year alone, this is happening, so yes, it's first going after the African American population, or but it's not going to stop there. Even if it's less severe against other ethnic populations, it's going to happen against other ethnic populations too. It's just the same kind of the statement that was used. I don't know if you remember this. Some Pastor Nehemiah, I think his name was something like that, in Nazi Germany, said, first they came after the communists, but I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist. Then they came after the Jews, but I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Jew. And then gypsies and gays and wherever else. And then when they came after me, there was no one left to speak up, or something. that's basically the way it's going to happen. But first, yes, they are coming. Or I shouldn't say first, but primarily they have targeted and committed a lower level form of genocide. I say lower level right now that we know of, but of course throughout history it's a much higher level of genocide, with the wiping out of blacks and Africans in the Congo, and the in just the United States alone, just so many lynchings, thousands of lynchings in earlier part of the century of the 20th century. And it's just constant. It may be not in the levels it was before the civil rights movement, but of course they're targeting the leaders, and now they're just targeting people en masse again with these, with just police being allowed to kill and without, barely, not even getting fired, much less put in jail like they should be. So I agree with you about that. It is really terrible, but it doesn't mean that other ethnic groups shouldn't be highly scared and concerned, because yes, other ethnic groups can be next, and probably will be next.
With the COINTELPRO campaign from the 1960s, one of the points that Dr. Kenneth O'Reilly emphasizes in racial matters was that obviously Dr. King, Assata Shakur, these types of individuals were what you would call major targets. Angela Davis, people that were very well known, very influential, very well spoken, very informed about the problem that they were trying to address. So obviously these are big targets, but it ended up just being any black person. If you happen to be at a meeting, or you happen to show an interest, maybe you got a Muhammad Speaks paper, a Nation of Islam paper, or a Panther Speaks, maybe you got a paper or something, or you were at a meeting, you could end up being having your name in a folder or something, people saying that you are someone that we should be keeping an eye on. Can you talk about how you think that might work in this current environment? And I mean, now you have social media and so many other things that can be used to monitor, and so many things where people can voluntarily kind of report and provide information about what they're doing and who they're hanging out with, and photos of where they're at and what have you. Yeah,
well, I do think that a lot of us activists, activists who have made any kind of headway, are probably being watched, because God knows that they have the means to watch millions these days, and the evidence has shown that they have been watching millions of us. So amongst those millions of us, they might target, they might focus in a little more carefully on, people interested in activism. Now, to use the term, black identity extremist is just ridiculous. Of course, it's just who's got the definition of what extreme is. Extreme is just getting involved in peaceful protest. According to the FBI, that would be extreme. That's might be their version of extreme, and it likely is. And because that's what their version of extreme was during the Black Panther era, because Black Panthers were involved in legal protests. Everything they did was legal, of course. Huey Newton would come with law books and read them to the police that were beating his fellow black citizens, to read them their rights and say they had no right, the police had no right to keep beating them. But at that time in California, it was legal to carry guns in California, and they carried guns in those situations. But so that's the way they work. They'll use different terms all the time. They'll call Black Panthers terrorists. Now they call Black Lives Matter activists black identity extremists. It's ridiculous. It's nothing's extreme about it. It's just following through on their supposedly constitutional rights. But when it comes to black activism and protesting these incredible police atrocities, no, you're not. You're just called an extremist. You're not supposed to have that right to not be spied on as you just organize peaceful protests. So that's the sad state we're living in. We're living in a fascist police state. There's really no other way to look at it, and plenty of establishment people have even admitted that. Plenty of professors have talked about how we currently resemble a fascist police state, and I don't know when we haven't, to be honest, but but now it's getting uglier and uglier, and more brutal and more genocidal in a kind of open way, because it's called on video so much, with the new technologies. And so, that, and the fact that we do have an oligarchy, we don't have any real form of democracy here. We do have an oligarchy. Plenty of top professors, political science professors, have written articles about, yes, we are an oligarchy now. We don't have a democracy anymore. Those oligarchs, I show the evidence in my books and in film, and there's plenty of other people that have documented the evidence that those oligarchs are incredibly racist and incredibly hyper-capitalist, too.
Would it be accurate when you use the term oligarchy and the term fascist police state? Would it be accurate to say that those are synonyms for the system of white supremacy?
Oh yeah. Well, no doubt. That's what they are. They are white supremacists, these oligarchs. And it's just the thing is they are prejudiced. They are prejudiced against all ethnic groups, though. They're just particularly racist. But their prejudices, are widespread. Their support of the Nazis was well known. There's loads of documentation for how much of the of this 1% oligarchical society or whatever supported the Nazis. Tons of award-winning journalists have documented this. Edwin Black just being one of them. But he probably did some of the best documentation. His most well-known book was IBM and the Holocaust, but his other book, War Against the Weak, just showed their level of prejudice. And so when they funded the rise of the Nazis, and then used them as a kill, basically directed them to kill about 27 million Soviet people in the Soviet Union, and in Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States, he describes how the fact that they had maybe 1 or 2 battalions on the other side of the Nazis, so they just let them basically attack the Soviets without, with barely a resistance on the other front, on the other side, on the kind of western side of the Nazis. And then when the Soviets started beating them back, that's when the Allies, the Americans, got more involved, because they didn't want to see the Soviets overrun Germany and take over so much of Europe. So it just shows what that was about, and that war was really about. But then they saved. New York Times has even admitted at least 10,000 Nazis. Some described more than that. Some other journalists describe 20,000 or more, maybe 50,000. Some people say Nazis to be used in our spy programs, our CIA programs here in the United States, but also down to send them down to tens of thousands down to Latin America to control Latin America. So that was a huge war on Latin America. And
hold on, I just wanted to hop in. Mr. Potage, I just wanted to hop in really quick because I know you're not going to be with the whole program.
Sure.
I appreciate the response to that question. I also wanted to get a response on the air. You are an addiction specialist, an addiction counselor by trade.
Well, I'm a mental health counselor who happened to start with doing addictions, so that's my expertise. But I'm a mental health counselor in general,
okay,
and handle a lot of different kinds of mental health problems. Yeah.
Okay. When you were last on the program, and this was last year, you were talking about your second book, Drugs as a Weapon Against Us. We had a listener.
Drugs as Weapons Against Us, yeah.
Thank you. We had a listener, he wrote in, and I guess he had a critique about your views of what was presented on that broadcast. I wanted to read his response, and then just that way you could get an on-air response to what he had to say. So this person, Calvin Jones, he wrote and he said, I listened to a disturbing interview with John Potash, April 2016. Though he might be well-intended, Mr. Potash is just wrong about too many things that if followed, injure or beguile us. Mr. Potash alluded that Mr. Phil Smith in particular and Alternate in general are dupes, if not agents, of CIA-led or organized drug peddlers trying to injure black people via the wrong kind of drug message. I know Mr. Smith and I have written for this publication. I, like Mr. Smith, advocate legalization, not use of all drugs. We do so as a means, first and foremost, to end one important tool in the modern enslavement of black people, drug prohibition. Thus, I wrote my dissertation on the effects and causes of the drug war and investigated theories of drug addiction, the political economy of prisons, and more. Potage purports to be a drug counselor. He claims that marijuana use is associated with low motivation and dropping out of school. Such studies arguing this have been and are easily debunked. Furthermore, drug counseling is less effective than no treatment. I will be glad to show the studies on that. Thank you for your attention, Mr. Jones. Your response, John?
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to impugn Alternet at it, by no means. No, I don't think Alternet is a tool for the CIA at all. I do wonder about Phil Smith because of the fact that when I first was trying to publish an article in 1995, in the spring of 1995, while Tupac Shakur was still alive, I was trying to publish an article on the FBI, what would be a FBI latter-day counterintelligence program targeting of Tupac Shakur. And I kept trying to submit it to the Covert Action Quarterly office. And when some of the top editors would come by, Phil Smith actually took me physically out of the office, led me out of the office, and would tell me why I shouldn't talk to that person who was walking by. It was Lou Wolf, who ended up in later years became a good friend of mine, is one of the founding publishers of Covert Action Quarterly. And so Smith kept my article from them. Lou Wolf told me later that he never got my article from Phil Smith. And it wasn't until he physically got my article in his hands, they said, this is great, we've got to publish this about the FBI targeting of Tupac. And so he got it finally in 1998 and then published it then. But so I am concerned about Phil Smith. I'm not concerned about Alternet. I think they publish a lot of good articles. I do think they may be a little jaded and off about psychedelics. Now, in my book, I do argue that weed, marijuana, I take the point of view of Michelle Alexander that marijuana is used to lock up black people en masse and people in general. But no, I still stand by. I look, working as addictions counselor and reading studies, I disagree with them about, and my personal experience make me feel that no, marijuana does cause lower achievement, more apathy, more laziness. I almost dropped out of high school because of my weed problem. I almost failed out of high school, I should say, but I just barely passed, and then went on to do very well in college when I weaned down off of my weed problem. But counseling people, hundreds, if not thousands of people over the last 28 years, many with addictions, of course, the number of people, as I say, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, I've been counseling people without addictions also, with other mental health problems, but with addictions, yes, I've seen loads of people who, yes, do worse because of smoking weed in high school. It's very common, and I disagree that, he can say he's found studies that say it doesn't cause any problems with young people smoking weed in high school. I'm not talking about occasional smoking weed. I'm talking about regular smoking of weed, but when kids regularly smoke weed in high school, it's shown to change brain functioning and, cause problems later in life in terms of, just increasing addictions. So I just disagree with him on that. And Phil Smith, I don't know. Phil could be a fine, great, well-meaning guy. So I really don't know. I know what he did with me in my Tupac article. I also know that he published, he seems to be focused on a lot of articles that promote drugs in a positive way, and I just don't agree with that. And the MKUltra, the CIA's MKUltra program, whether they have anything to do with Phil Smith or not, I don't know for sure. I'm just saying that the MKUltra program did do everything they could to promote drugs, and people, whether Phil Smith is knowingly or unknowingly is following that same course, I can't be sure of why. I will say, though, that the that was the purpose of the CIA's MKUltra program, and the CIA's MKUltra program did have many front companies. Now, I don't think Alternet is a front company for the CIA. I think Alternet's a very good, positive outlet for news and politics. Phil Smith, on the other hand, I just don't know. I don't know what his angle is and what his where he's coming from. But the front companies of the CIA's MKUltra program were the Human Ecology Fund and a number of other front companies. But today, they seem to be the group called MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I show all the links between MAPS and the CIA's MKUltra program from the 60s. There's another a group called the Hefter Institute, which is also has links to the same people involved in MKUltra. So I think that is still going on today, and I just disagree on that note on some of those things that your writer wrote in about.
When we spoke with you last year, I asked you about cannabis legalization. It's legal in even more spots than it was when we spoke, more states than when we spoke about a year ago. When I asked you last year, you said you didn't really have an opinion in terms of legalization. It's been a year. Is that something that you've looked at? Do you have an assessment now in terms of whether legalizing cannabis would be a good thing to help beneficial to Black people specifically with regards to racist enforcement of drug prohibition?
In terms of racist enforcement of drug prohibition, I think in that way I could see it possibly being a good thing, yeah. In terms of people using it en masse, that I'm not so sure. I can't say I think that's a very good thing. I think that's probably a little more negative, because it's just, it's like what, if you read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and seen that Soma, it's just one of the many drugs to lull us along to get rolled over by the conservative forces. As we're more stoned, we're not as competent, we're not as sharp to carry out, our activist programs and activist projects. And so I just don't think it's going to help, our cause against the fascist forces if we're getting stoned all the time. So that's one opinion, but I don't know. Other people may disagree with that. It's just my opinion on that.
Folks have a question they want to get into Mr. John Potash. The number is 641-715-3640 and the code 564943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Again, he will not be with us for the full broadcast, so do not lollygag. Go ahead and get a hand up and get your question in. The caller dialed in last four. This is retired firefighter in Florida. If you had a question, and since we have limited time, if folks could just get to your question, that would be super appreciated. Retired firefighter, if you had a question, proceed.
Yes. The first question is, because I am forgetful, non-white Black person, are you a white male?
I am a white male, yeah.
Okay. My next question, logically speaking, would be, what is your intent with this information that you've been? I'm talking about your books, all of your writings. What is your ultimate reasoning for putting out this information?
Well, my intent with the FBI war on Tupac Shakur and Black leaders was to partly use Tupac to show what was happening to this incredible young man, Tupac Shakur. He was an absolutely incredible genius, creative genius, and just genius of a guy, great activist and all that, to show what was happening to him, but also to reach young Black people in general, to show them the incredible history of the Black Panthers, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and show them what could be done. But at the same time, the tactics that the fascists were using against the community to enable to help people stop this from happening again, to stop this from happening to any more Black leaders. With drugs as weapons against us, with the subtitle being the CIA's murders targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac, and other activists, I was trying to show all ethnic communities what's happening, the way drugs is being used as a weapon in the fascist war against us, and how if we could get out of that drug world, then we could be better, do better things with our activism with a clearer mind, and show some of the tactics that were used through that world and through our musicians to try to make us think or act us or believe certain things that just weren't necessarily true and weren't for our benefit, but were for the oligarchs' benefit, and to fight the fascists better by realizing these things. So, yeah, that's my intent. Does that answer your question?
Well, from what I'm hearing from that one particular task that you have engaged in, yes, just that one. But I was talking about all of the books, all of the things that you're doing. What is your ultimate purpose for doing it, and what is the goal?
To try to change society for the better, and that's my general goal. But basically, to help educate people to stop any more great leaders from being taken out by the fascists, to help us all, empower us all in ways, and to try to just stop these fascists and make society hopefully less racist, less more progressive, stop the wars, stop the genocide, stop and to create a better society. That's basically it. Yeah.
Last question. Have you considered, to all of this that you're talking about, that it's primarily, ultimately, the people that's responsible for this problem, racism, white supremacy, is white people? And what are you doing to white people? What is your answer to this problem?
Well, it's to
white supremacy.
It's to constantly try to educate white people when get them in touch, get other white people in touch with their racism, help them understand their white privilege, help them understand the racist and hierarchical nature of our society, and how it keeps perpetuating this all these racial stereotypes, all these prejudices, and help them come to see things differently, see things as not to believe the oligarchs' propaganda, their racist propaganda that breeds more racism and breeds more of this race hatred. And so I do a lot of interviews with a lot of different white groups, white media groups on the same subjects, and talk in the same way about it. But so it's just to try to change these attitudes and turn things around.
Appreciate Gus, can I ask just one last question?
Let me nab some of the other.
Very short.
Let me nab some of the other callers, and then I can swing back around. Caller formerly Red in Ohio. If you had a question for Mr. Potage, your line should be open. Proceed.
Hello, and thank you for taking my call. And hello, Mr. Potage, for coming onto the show. I have two questions. It might actually just be, I just might ask just the one. With the current, I'm mainly speaking about the current opioid epidemic. So can you provide any reasons why this current drug epidemic is being described as a mental health issue, when it seems like in the past, especially when it came to like the, if I'm not mistaken, like the 80s and 90s, when it was the crack epidemic, it was not looked upon as it being a mental health issue? That's the first question.
Yeah, well, there is so many, aspects of the crack cocaine problem that they, I look, all these drugs are being used as weapons against us. But with the opioids, because it starts affecting, a lot of white youth, I think that's what's fueling them, being more gentle about it and saying, oh, it's a mental health issue, it's not a crime, issue. And when with crack, there is loads of evidence that, it was coming in from CIA assets in Latin America through CIA assets were then getting it into into the U.S. in the 80s and 90s, and you had a network that was trying to spread it through, I argue, a lot of black communities. Of course, it hit white communities too, but I think they were targeting into black communities in particular, and they were using it to fuel gang wars, and they were promoting they were pushing the gangs. They were, I think, fueling the gang wars. People like Tupac Shakur were trying to stop the gang wars and get peace truces between the gangs. So I think there's a lot of racist elements to the way they approach, the opioid epidemic now versus the crack epidemic, in past decades. The crack still is a problem, of course, but so I think that's part of it for sure. But addictions in general is just a big mental health issue. And of course, they want to I guess frame it in different ways depending on which population they're focusing on.
All right, thank you. And the second question is, would you agree, once again speaking about the current epidemic, would you agree that the current opioid epidemic is an example of how white supremacy is a much bigger issue than classism? Because as you also mentioned, white people, and what I have been researching, it seems like more lower class white people are affected, and there are many states who are adopting policies using taxpayer money to combat the issue. Thank you, and I'll mute my line.
Yeah, I don't know which one's automatically bigger, but white supremacy is, it's a huge issue, and if anyone tries to tell you no, it's the class issue is more important than the white supremacy issue, it's just, how do they know that, and where do they get that from? Why are they putting that above the white supremacy issue? It's just, I think that's wrong. I think it's these drugs in general, they're being used. Granted, they're being used against all of us, but there's lots of evidence I show in my book that a number of these drugs were being targeted towards particular communities of color, particularly black communities, and there's just a long history of that. And I tried to show that a good bit in my book, in my second book. And a little bit in my first book, but that's I think that if someone tries to say that class issues are bigger than the racism issue, I just disagree with that in a big way. How much bigger white supremacy would be than class issues, I don't know. I don't put a value on either of them as being so much bigger than the other, but I definitely wouldn't put one above I wouldn't put the class issue above white supremacy.
Appreciate the question, Red. Person who dialed in, last four digits, 9451. 9451. If you had a question, I think that's Thomas in New York. Sorry about that. Thomas in New York, if you had a question, your line should be open, sir.
Good evening, Gus. Good evening, Mr. Potash.
Your volume is kind of low.
Guys, you can call me John, too. It's easy to call me John.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
I'm sorry about that, Gus. Is this better?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. I would have, this first question I want to ask you is, you keep talking about fascism. What do you think about Antifa? And am I wrong when I consider them a white supremacist group as well?
I'm sorry, say it one more time. I couldn't hear that. I'm sorry.
So what are your thoughts on Antifa? And I asked you if I was wrong when I considered them a white supremacist group as well.
I don't know Antifa well enough to comment on them. I'm sorry to say I've heard about them and I've read a little bit about them, but I don't know what exactly I get it's supposed to stand for anti-fascist, but I don't know enough about them to comment on them. Sorry about that.
That's okay. My second question for you is the future plans of drugs in America. You spoke quite eloquently how the marijuana was more than likely a CIA op. Do you think that the heroin use, in particular in the black community, the use of drinking lean, do you think that's also a CIA plan?
the last thing you said was drinking.
Drinking a lot of the youth are drinking this codeine drink.
Okay. Yeah, I do think that that opiate epidemic there, codeine, in drinks and heroin, it's all opiates. And yes, I do think that is a CIA plan, and that was, the CIA MKUltra program was using as many drugs as weapons as possible. I mean, that the MKUltra program, that basically what it was. Now, it's supposed to have stopped in 1963 or so, but really it was just JFK trying to close it down, and they just changed the name to something called MK Search. And then when people found out about that and they tried to close it down, they just changed the name again. As I said, same thing they did with the counterintelligence program. So those were all using a number of different drugs as weapons against the communities, but opiates is the longest running weapon they've used against communities. They call it the opiate. Karl Marx talked about the opiate of the masses. Basically, it was just sedating the masses, and that's what they did against China when the British, along with some of the American oligarchs who participated, had the opium war against China in the mid 1800s. They were trying to opiate the masses. They were forcing China to accept opium, into their country when China was trying to ban it and outlaw it. And the British won those wars, and the American oligarchs that were trading in the opium with them were some of the wealthiest people in our country right now. The Pierponts, the Russells, that Pierpont later became part of John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, largest bank in the world, J.P. Morgan Chase. So they were in the opium trade, for the last 200 years or so, at least. And so then they have the Vietnam War over the Golden Triangle, as I said, and then now the war in Afghanistan over the Golden Crescent, the poppy fields there. So it's just no coincidence that we're fighting whole wars over these these poppy field regions, and then getting those huge amounts of those opiates, the heroin and the codeine and all that, and targeting communities of color with those drugs, and particularly black communities with those drugs.
Did you have another question, Thomas, in New York? Was that it?
Absolutely, Gus. This is real quick, sir. These two very quick, just 2-word answers. What do you think that, as a white person, what do you think white people feel more comfortable being called? White supremacists or white criminals?
I don't know. I mean, I think white supremacist is like more accurate for whites in general, because I'd like to think that myself and some other whites are trying to fight the white supremacy, the white supremacist hierarchy in our country. But certainly a good percentage of the people at the top of the white supremacist hierarchy are criminals. And and the white cops, that are getting away with murder are incredible criminals.
I'm not talking about people at the top. I'm talking about just as an overall. What would make you as a white man feel more comfortable if black people are calling you, all white people, white supremacists, or if they're calling them white criminals? What would make
white supremacists
would make them feel more comfortable?
I guess, I also speak for me, white supremacist.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Appreciate that. The person that called in, last 4 digits, 8554. If you had commentary, proceed.
Yes, I do. Hey, thanks for taking my call. My name is Derek. I'm calling from Chicago, Illinois. One quick comment to the last caller, Thomas, about the group Antifa. They're basically another offshoot.
We don't. If a person asks a question to a white person, a non-white person is never supposed to answer. That's just counter-racist code that I go by. So if you have a question,
for
Mr.
sorry about
Potage,
that. No
proceed.
problem. Okay. No, but
If you know about Antifa, though, I would like to hear more about it. I just don't know that much about him right now.
Well, I was just going to say quickly that
if you can get to your question, sir. If you can get to your question, sir.
You can just give a question, then I just didn't know Gus's rules. I'm sorry, Gus.
Okay. Now, quick questions. What do you know about the death of Eazy-E? Was Jerry Heller connected with the death? And then number two, as far as Suge Knight is concerned, what was his direct connection with Tupac's death?
Yeah, so it's a good question about Eazy-E because I just don't know. When I was writing these books, people would ask me about a lot of other characters, a lot of other people, and I just I had to limit the amount of research I did to get the books out and to make them in a readable form. So they weren't encyclopedias of activist musicians that were targeted, and so I just couldn't cover everybody's deaths. All I've heard about Eazy-E is he died of HIV-related issues. I don't know. I don't know how he got the HIV. I don't know. I've read things that people think that maybe someone gave him the HIV. I really don't know. I do know that the FBI had them under surveillance. NWA had tried to ban some of their concerts after they came out with their first album their Straight Outta Compton album. I mean, saying "fuck the police" and all that. And so I do think that they were obviously under surveillance and being targeted. I just don't know about Eazy-E's death. I don't know how it happened. I don't know who was the cause. Now Suge Knight, the evidence supports that he had increasingly major, more violent criminal actions, and he was getting more and more, legal, repercussions for them until there was a point where all of a sudden he had a majorly violent act, and he didn't get anything for it. And I show that he kept committing violent acts, and they kept getting dismissed because it was that point that he was being used as a police undercover agent. They said, if you do this for us, you'll be kind of untouchable. And that's the way they did it with an undercover agent in the Chicago Black Panthers that set up Fred Hampton's assassination. And it's just the evidence shows that he was low on the U.S. intelligence totem pole, with Dave Kenner being much higher up, and even Reggie Wright Jr. being higher up because his father, Reggie Wright Sr., was head of the Compton Gang Police Division. But he was still, he aided the assassination of Tupac, all the evidence shows, and that he also aided, Dave Kenner and Reggie Wright's, drug trafficking through death row records and gun running, and they were trying to end the Bloods versus Crips peace truce that Tupac had helped engender, and Tupac's extended Black Panther family had helped engender across the country, where there was tons of Bloods and Crips peace truces. And the Death Row Records was trying to end that, and they did end it in certain places for a while, but then activists got it going again. So.
All right. Okay, thanks for taking my call. I'm going to go ahead and mute my line.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for the call. So, Gus, I'm sorry I have to eat dinner now. It's 9 p.m. on the East Coast here, and is there any last words you wanted, or anything else before we wrap things up?
Let's see. I guess if I could get in one final question. You said that with your work, kind of trying to make white people more aware of their racism and their quote-unquote white privilege, what has led you to conclude that there are a significant number of white people who are unaware of racism and or their quote-unquote white privilege?
Oh, are you kidding me? I hear it all the time, Gus. I mean, everywhere and anywhere. People who think they're, more progressive and think that they're, we all have to continue to work towards, all white people, I think, have to, myself included, have to constantly continue to work on our prejudices. and and it's just going to be it's a lifetime amount of work. But some people I just don't think are as aware of that they have to constantly be working on being understanding their white privilege, understanding their amounts of prejudice, and how they need to make progress on them. And so I see it all over. I mean, I hear it all over, and that's just the way it is. That's all I can say about it. The examples are too many to even name right now.
If anyone is ignorant about racism, it's black people. Black people.
That's been my observation for years and years and years now, but I could be in error. Our guest, I will get the title right the last time, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, as well as the FBI war on Tupac Shakur and black leaders. Who talked about both books on the programs before. You can go back in the archives to hear his previous visits. Always a pleasure to speak with John Potash. Thank you so much for hanging out on this Sunday evening. I guess enjoy your meal, sir.
Thank you, Gus. Take care.
Yes, sir. Evening.
Bye-bye now.
Context of White Supremacy. Man, we should have a tally for the number of white guests specifically that have exited the program for a meal. And time has been irrespective. We've had programs that are significantly earlier in the day, and still they were. We even Betsy Leandar Wright, admitted white supremacist. She is the co-author of the book Color of Wealth. She was a guest on the program in 2009, and she was literally cooking while on the program, admitting to be a racist white supremacist and explaining how the economics of that system work out so that you have lots of poor and broke black people all over the world, but cooking a meal while she was on the program. At any rate, I said at the beginning of the broadcast, if folks have comments that they want to get in on what they heard from Mr. Potash, that's fine as well. I'll also explain, if we have newer listeners, part of my counter-racist code, I think the terminology that some people use, compensatory conversation control, anytime you're talking to a white person, even if it's a white person that you think might have constructive information, the prevailing thought should be, I am talking to someone who is probably a race soldier, racist white supremacist, like at minimum, that's what you should be thinking. So you still have to have counter-racist rules in place. One of those rules is, if it's a conversation, you're talking to a white person, there are other non-white people present. If a non-white person asks a white person a question, no non-white person should ever step forward to answer that question. Ever. If you want to share information with that non-white person, that is great. But if a question has been directed to a white person, they should be the only one answering. And the reason being, and you got a great demonstration right there. Mr. Potage was inviting the non-white person to come in and talk about this. Now, we have a limited amount of time to ask Mr. Potage questions. If non-white people are coming in and taking that time to ask their own questions, less time where he can be questioned about things, less time. And a lot of times what happens in these circumstances, when the non-white person, if they come in to answer that question and said, sometimes everything gets lost. The white person never even answers the question. It just goes on to something else. We might move on, to anything else can happen. I've seen that happen a lot. I just do that. And that is a habit. Many victims will be encouraged if we think the white person is going to lie, or we just have information to share. It's not saying that non-white people are stupid. It's just saying if we are asking a question of someone who is a racist suspect identified as white, that should be the only person to answer that question at the time the question is asked. Then you can share. If you have information you want to share, do that later. Now, that's explained. If folks have commentary they want to share on Mr. Potage, that is great. We can get that in. In fact, we'll go ahead and do that now. I do have, I wanted to continue with the clip that Amy Goodman was where she was discussing the Black Identity Extremists segment from just a few days ago. I want to play a little bit more of that, but I'll go ahead and get the commentary in from if folks have anything they want to share with regards to Mr. Potage. Folks can get that in now. In fact, I will lead the way. That right there is also another illustration all of the people, and I mean, you can pile up everybody. This is why I said this is one I've come to a conclusion on. You're probably not going to hear Gus have any much more to say about this because I've already discussed this before. I've made a conclusion. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm just pointing out obvious logic to me. I did not hear Mr. Potage switch to use the term white supremacy. It's not in the title of his book. I heard oligarchs, conservatives, prejudice, white privilege even, all over the place, not white supremacy. Nothing about his conduct, even upon asking directly. When you say oligarchy, oligarchs, racist, fascists, is that equivalent? Is that synonymous with the system of white supremacy? Yeah, well, yeah, they're racist. Even then he didn't switch to white supremacist. He, in my view, he knows that's the most accurate term. That is what we're having. It's no argument. It's no discussion about capitalism is close and all this other stuff. What is dominating the war, from the title from his book, the war is the system of white supremacy and dominating black people in particular, everybody that's classified as non-white. I have never in my life seen any evidence that, oh yeah, white people are quote unquote empowered, they feel better. Nothing about them is approving, accepting, glad to see non-white people using the term white supremacy. Consistently, what I've heard is exactly that. They will use a variety of other terms, more, and they'll just keep continuing as the conversation goes on. White privilege, conservatives, radicals, left-wing, right-wing, fascists, you name it. They'll just keep adding them on. Bigots, they'll just keep rolling right on, but they will not be saying white supremacists, system of whites. They will not be doing that, in my opinion, because that's accurate. You have a system put together by deception. You do not want to use accurate terms. It doesn't give them power when you use accurate terms. That right there begins to put their power, their domination in jeopardy. When you have people, you are dependent upon keeping them ignorant. When they start using terms that reveal truth, wow, that could be a problem. Just my opinion, and I would have to put in for the record, in my view, major act of racism. Whites there, just in the use of terms. We switch to fascism, the right wing, conservative, all of that prejudice, just that right there is a major act of racism, white supremacy. I don't know if it's capitalism or all of that just spreads confusion for non-white people from a person who has a lot of accurate information about COINTELPRO and white people's, as he said, accurate term, war on black people. War, accurate term. Not willing to use the accurate term when it comes to what is the overall system that is producing, guiding this war on black people like Tupac Shakur and Dr. King, Assata Shakur, Dr. Afeni Shakur, and the list goes on. Other black identity extremists to be named at a later date. I will hush there. Folks that dialed in with a hand up, do you have any commentary you want to share on Mr. Potage on a Sunday where a white man went and shot up a church in Texas? Did other folks have commentary?
Can I be heard?
Potage? Yes, sir.
Yes, that is almost exactly on what I was going to question the guest on, because I did hear the word white privilege. Now, mind you, he's been on this program how many times?
This would be thrice. This would be thrice.
Okay, that means 3 times he heard the name of the program, Context of White Supremacy. The word is constantly used by victims of racism, white supremacy, and including the guest has used this word over and over again, but yet he uses the word when he describes white people, in other words, people on his team, as having something called privilege as opposed to power. And therefore, by a white person, which he admits that he's a white person, I think he also in the past, I could be wrong, admitted that he also is a racist. When they give inaccurate information to non-white people, at that moment, that white person is practicing racism, white supremacy. So we witnessed that while he was on the program in itself. These are some of the most potently dangerous white people who takes up the time and energy to confiscate information, accurate information, but what they do with it is tweak it here and there to confuse non-white victims. And for the most part, from my studies with the Tim Wise and some of these other white people who call themselves counter-racists, they are very dangerous in what they're doing. And I suspect that he's also a part of that branch in the white quote-unquote army. And that's what I was going to ask. I'm basically going to accuse him. I can't prove it because I'm a non-white victim of racist white supremacy, but greatly suspect him for practicing racism. That's it.
Heard?
Red now in Nevada.
I definitely agree with both Gus and retired firefighters' comments. And like the last question I asked, just thinking that it was very simple, of course. You know, it does seem like how this opioid epidemic is being handled, with him being a drug counselor. You know, I would assume that would be very obvious to him that this is an example of how racism is a much larger white supremacy, which is the term that I use. And as everybody said, he didn't use that. He kept saying oligarchy, which I know on other programs that I listened to with him on it, that's the main thing. It almost makes it seem as if, you know, he's basically operating under the same guidelines as, you know, of course, the dreaded Tim Wise, you know, well, there's just these few white people. And we know, at least, you know, the people on this line know that's not the case. More, if it was just a few white people, it wouldn't be a worldwide system. But I kind of was a little bit confused by the answer. He said, well, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say that, you know, racism, or I don't even know what word he used. I wouldn't say that it's a bigger problem than classism, but you can't necessarily put classism over top of it. So then that would mean that white supremacy is a bigger problem. But that's all I wanted to comment. Thank you.
Confusion. Other folks who dialed in with a hand up, did you have commentary? I reckon we have time, so if you did not ask a question and you just want to share your thoughts on what you heard, you can do that as well. 641-715-3640 and the code 564-943#. Press *61 if you would like to share a thought or two.
May I be heard?
We'll go with the black female caller in New York first, and then we'll nab Thomas later.
Thank you, Gus. Thank you, Thomas. I just want to concur with the firefighter from Florida. I think I even sent you a little email, Gus, while he was on the program. Buckets and buckets of words. Those words that he using are extremely misleading. Oligarchy, conservative forces, and prejudices. Everything but what the actual problem is. And I can remember his first time on the show, and I always like to compare, you know, whether or not a person who comes on your show more than once is consistent. So far, Dr. Welsing, Dr. Niana Rasayan, maybe I could name, you know, Umar Johnson. They've been consistent with what they was, you know, with their stance on and their views and what their goals are. I listened to him tonight and I compared him because I can generally remember, you know, when I hear people, you know, this sense of where they are, or, you know, and if they're still the same. He is sounding so much more like, you know, one of these white folks who attend some of these rallies and holds up the sign. Basically to agree with what the firefighter from Florida said. I don't think he's serious. I think he's making a lot of money. I'm thinking like he's like very Tim Wise-ish. I'm just not feeling that. He's not sounding the same way that he was when he first started out in this game. Not that maybe he wasn't serious back then either, but with these terms that he's throwing around, oligarchy and stuff like that, I think that he's intentionally misleading and practicing racism by using those terms. And Thomas from New York's question, what is much more comfortable for them to be called? I think that that was very, very revealing. I would rather be called somebody who's supreme than what I actually am, which is a criminal. And another thing, I'm not too sure. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure actually that white people they're not capable of not practicing racism. From a physical aspect, from what we know about what Dr. Layla Africa has taught us, what Dr. Rasayan has taught us, about our physical makeups, and about also from what Dr. Welsing has taught us about the migration, how they migrated from one area of the earth into another area of the earth, and the phenotypes and things of that prevent them from feeling that level of humanity and physically and spiritually that won't allow them to act civilly towards other human beings. So I just don't believe that they're capable of it. But anyway, I won't ramble on. Thank you for taking my call, Gus.
Yes, ma'am. Thomas in New York.
Great examples of white obfuscation, not dealing with the problem, switching the topic, never getting a straight answer. He has become much more refined over the years in his ability to push his, racist agenda. So I agree with the callers, everyone who's spoken so far. And however, I don't think that he was being very accurate with my question about what he would rather be called. But if Brother Derek is still there, and thus less time proceeds, I would love to hear what he was going to say before. And I agree with you, Gus. We don't help white people, especially by giving them information. I mean, we see who owns Google. They got all the information in the world. They don't need it from us. But I would love to hear what Derek had to say. Thank you.
Are you with us, sir? Did you want to comment, Derek? Derek, did you want to comment, sir? Are you here?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Proceed.
Yeah, like I said, forgive me because, like I said, this is my first time calling into the show, so I didn't know.
No apologies. No apologies. No apologies.
Right. To answer Brother Thomas's question, I was actually with he knows what I'm talking about, Brother Robert X last night here in Chicago. We had a forum, and we were talking about the white supremacist group Antifa. So basically, Antifa is one of the many white supremacist groups that George Soros is funding to fight against the Trump paradigm. So that's basically all of what I wanted to say because we were discussing this the particular issue last night. So I don't know if that answers Brother Thomas's question or not.
Yes, you did, man. You said my love and regards to Brother Robert X. So Tutmos from New York says of his regards. Thank you, Brother Derek.
All right, no problem.
Any of the other folks that are dialed in have commentary? We miss anybody? Anybody else dialed in have commentary? Oh, the caller at 4674. Did you have commentary?
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yes. Peace to the callers, to the hosts, and to the platform. And I guess what I would choose to speak about, since I didn't really hear the beginning of the show, is the shooting in Texas where, the white person, suspected racist white supremacist, went and killed, I believe, his own people. But what I take from it is that black people should be more aware that maybe we could be next. And fortunately, not unfortunately, but fortunately, we are engaged in deep discussions and thoughts about what the system of racism, white supremacy is, how it operates. And I think now that we are in a time that this group of black people or whoever, the more clear we're expressing ourselves about that system, we can probably affect our reality. But the guy that killed the people, I want to know more about, his ideologies, was he close to being a racist white supremacist in all reality, or what, white nationalist or whatever. And I noticed that the details was coming out very slow about what happened. But definitely we see the white people taking a lot of care and time when it's their own people doing stuff. So, kind of remind us when we take time to do positive things for our people or whatever, we see another group of people, innately, taking 2 or 3 days to respond to acts of terrorism that come from their own people, because maybe they're afraid of when we can come competently, express ourselves about racism, white supremacy, terrorism, not just talking about something that's less than terrorism, but talking about it as terrorism and dealing with it as terrorism. So just like we see other nations and countries and groups of people doing, I think it's time that black people can start to talk and act upon, in self-defense, their terrorism. That's all I wanted to say.
The shooting, the suspect named Devin Kelly, that's the individual that they've identified as the suspected killer in this instance, that from the reports they said police shot and killed him. I guess he fled the scene of the original shooting at the church in Texas. This is supposed to be near the San Antonio area in Texas that happened today at a church. The church looks to be predominantly white, First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs, Texas. I posted the link on our Facebook page today, at least from the photos on their Facebook page from before today. It looks like a small congregation. When I say small, like less than 100 people, of mostly whites from the images that I saw. But I'm sure they'll have more details to come in the next few days or what have you. But at least from the initial reports that I saw at the time that we went on air, I did not see anything identifying this as an act of terrorism or a white identity extremist. In the image that they showed from his Facebook page, he had some sort of firearm. It looked like some sort of assault weapon. On his Facebook page, he had that actually in a picture of 2 very small children. When I say small children, like younger than 3, it looked like on his Facebook page, the person who's the alleged gunman at this point. But just another Sunday in the system of racism, white supremacy. Do we have anybody else have a quick comment they need to get in on? Mr. Potage, we miss anybody?
I just wanted to say this is the black female caller in New York. Thomas, thank you for using the term that I was reaching for. I'm still a victim. I couldn't use the words that I needed to use, and that word was refined to describe Mr. Potash's behavior and his words compared to the first time he was on the show and the second one. I just wanted to say thank you.
Right on. Raj should be with us as well. Did you have commentary, sir? Not hearing you. If you hit your mute button. Maybe he's not in a spot.
Yes, hello?
Oh, okay. We can hear you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was up here talking, thinking I unmuted myself. I apologize. Greetings to you and to the other callers and listeners. Great show. I didn't get to ask a question, but I did hear a later portion of the conversation. I think I came on at about maybe 20 minutes after. And I found it interesting, too, his myriad of words that he was using to describe white supremacy, and you ran them all down quite eloquently. And I kept thinking, man, because I have both of his texts. I've read the first one, Not Drugs as a Weapon Against Us Yet.
And I was just like you said, for a person who has such accurate information about the system of white supremacy, I find it very telling that he's not using the term white supremacy. And that's something that I find highly refined white supremacists do to create confusion. Because if you're not pinpointing what the issue is, it just takes the victim on this odyssey of wordplay. And if the person doesn't have an expanded vocabulary to know what these words mean and how these words apply to the system of white supremacy, they're just going to run along with anything the person says. And they'll never be able to put things together. Half the time, they might not even know how to spell the words that you're saying. I do that when I speak. I sometimes will spell the word so people understand how the word is worked out. So if they do want to follow up, they know exactly what the word is. There's no confusion in phonetics or anything. So I found that telling. He also called himself an anti-fascist, he said, in his earlier days. And that's why I was quite taken aback when Thomas in New York brilliantly asked him about Antifa, and he said he didn't really know much about them, because I'm like, you're basically calling yourself an anti-fascist. He used that exact term to describe himself, he said, early in his foray into his so-called counter-racist work. And just by saying that, I'm sure if the right people heard him discussing this, and if he said it on other programs, they would possibly associate him with Antifa just because he called himself an anti-fascist. And anytime, like you said, anytime that term fascist comes up, all you're speaking about is a white supremacist. And if they're not going to actually use those terms, again, it's to cause confusion. I do highly agree. I'm so glad that when he did, and I find it's something that white people do quite often as well, is that they will utilize a black person and showcase them in a way that shields them from having to speak to a question that they're asked. So when Derek wanted to explain what this group was to him, I immediately thought, no helping white people, please don't do it. But you jumped in so dexterously, and it was great to see how that worked itself out. Definitely, he was going to use up that time by allowing Derek to speak to what that was, since he claims he doesn't know what this is, what this group is about, and more about them, which is fine. But again, I agree with you emphatically, and I'm glad that it worked out that way, and you were able to further elucidate or explain why, this is your approach, because it's my approach as well. And I thought that was phenomenal, and thank you for that. I'm glad it's recorded so other people can hear this down the road. And when I think it was Red who brought up the fact that he was comfortable being called a white supremacist than a white criminal, I have a slightly different take on that, but I kind of agree with her, but I have a slightly different take. Now, because he was so refined to use all those words that he used to describe white supremacy and not actually say white supremacy, because on a few occasions, you, Gus, chimed in and said, would that be synonymous with white supremacy or the system of white supremacy? And he would answer affirmative every time. So that right there confirms that it was white obfuscation in motion right then and there. But I think that when he said that he was more comfortable with being called a white supremacist than a criminal, I think it was a Freudian slip. The reason why is because from what I've seen in my study of this system, one of the most uncomfortable things you can do to a white person is call them a racist or a white supremacist. That is something they want to steer away from very, very vehemently, and sometimes they'll even get violent to distance themselves from being associated with that term. So I think when he said he would prefer to be called a white supremacist than a white criminal, I think the white criminal aspect would lend to a more legal perception of white supremacy as a criminal act, which it is. I don't think he would have been comfortable being called a white supremacist. I just think that he went along with, in his mind, what was the thing that was more acceptable, but it was a Freudian slip. I think it would have been in reverse, just based on his behavior, obfuscating what the term white supremacy throughout the entire program. So that's my opinion on that. But I do agree with her as well. But I just think that was the reason it came up that way. He wasn't given any other option but those two. And I think it was a Freudian slip just based on how refined he was before. I don't think he would be as unrefined in that sense to say, yes, I want to be called supreme when he's supposed to be working against the system and writing these books, like he told the firefighter in Florida that he's writing this stuff to help black people better understand, all of this information about the system and help white people understand that they're racist and all of this stuff. I don't think a person who's claiming that and his behavior was conducive to him being comfortable with that term. I thought it was a Freudian slip. Thank you. I'll mute my line.
Indeed. I just wanted to share quickly, this has nothing to do with what we've been talking about. I got my wisdom teeth removed this past summer, and Roz got me colloidal silver to help with the healing process. And I have upgraded. I have a water flosser now, which is the greatest thing in the history of life. I absolutely love it. It is like the refinement as opposed to using string to floss. They have really pressurized stream of water that you can use to floss your teeth. It is amazing. It works way better than the regular floss you would use. But the added bonus is that you can put drops of colloidal silver or whatever else in the water and then floss. So now I can use my water pick and floss with the colloidal silver to freshen my gums and everything. It's absolutely amazing. Whew. Back to the regular discussion. It is really, really important. This doesn't have anything to do with the term white supremacy. If you reject that term, you should have terms that you use that accurately reveal truth about the system that we are in, our experience, and terms that revealing truth with the aim of producing justice. If you don't have terms that you use and a framework for how you see this problem, what will happen, you speak to someone like Mr. Potage or any other individual, racist man, racist woman, racist child, and they're using police state, fascism, white privilege, conservative, right wing. They just keep going on and on and on, prejudice. If you don't have terms, you will just end up picking from their grab bag of terms, whatever they're throwing out, whatever it happens to be today. Fascism. Oh, okay. Going against fascism. Oh, police state. Police state. Yep. Going against oligarchy. Oligarchy. What are you even talking about? What are these terms? Do you have definitions that you're using? White people, crazy talk, stupid talk. That's why we're reading that book right now. In my experience, man, racists, that is a huge weapon, especially when it's time to talk about serious matters. Racism, white supremacy being a very serious matter, warfare. They will just be extremely, and in my view, it's deliberately reckless and inaccurate with terms, vague with terms, terms with no definitions, and strategically not using the most accurate terms when they talk about these issues. And I mean, this can come in a myriad of different ways, but specifically, if you don't have your own terms, when you go into these conversations, if you're not paying attention to the words that are being used, you are just going to end up being drowned with their terms, and you're going to end up using, that's just the way that language works. If you're not mindful, you're going to end up taking their terms and just saying them, and you might not even know why you started talking about this problem in that manner. Why am I saying oligarchy? Why am I saying fascism? Why am I using these terms to describe these problems? Anything else folks wanted to make sure they get in? Satisfied the... Oh.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I would just like to say that I would wonder if he was in any type of fraternity, any type of Elks Club, or whether he was a Freemason.
I don't know. I know that he will be pretty legit, though. He has the foreword for his first book was written by Pam Africa and Mumia Abu Jamal, so he will have lots of street cred to authenticate as he goes along. Incidentally, our shout out in the foreword. The shout out in the foreword of the book, it does not say Context of White Supremacy. It says cows. You were going to speak, Roz?
Yes. It was great that you discussed the fact that Pam Africa wrote the foreword, because to me, that was the equivalent to what he did with Derek this evening. So her being the gateway to explaining things that he couldn't explain, she's going to also be an attractant for Black people who are studying the system of white supremacy to either buy his book or read his book. And then he's going into what he's discussing. No different than when he couldn't answer the question and Derek chimed in. When he did chime in, he was taking that opportunity to place Derek between himself and us as we were asking the question, and you caught it. And your mental dexterity was so perfect. It was awesome to just bear witness to it on this call this evening. So thank you.
If folks are satisfied, I did want to make sure I got in the clip, because we were just talking about this yesterday. My BFF, Amy Goodman, another quote-unquote leftist, well-meaning white person, hosts Democracy Now! They, like 2 weeks, and I had called them out because they had not said anything about the Black Identity Extremists report. They had done nothing on it. These folks will take up all day long. If someone spills, a drop of oil and it falls on a sea lion, they will spend the whole program talking about that. And oh my goodness, and the environmental injustice. And I'm not saying that that's not an issue, but I mean, my gosh, like there are war being waged against Black people and you have nothing to say. I think, in fact, they had a 60-second segment where they did acknowledge that this happened, and then they moved on. I mean, they will spend big time. I've seen them spend 40 minutes, an entire hour on, things that they deem to be important. Finally, they did spend a significant amount of time on the Black Identity Extremists report. They invited a Black female journalist, activist on the program to discuss the matter. I played a segment of that at the beginning of the program. As they continued, somehow the conversation switched to Russia. Started out with Black Identity Extremists, then it migrates to Russia. This is where they pick up in the dialogue with Malkia Cyril. Hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. But they're picking up in the dialogue where now they've switched to Russia's meddling. We were just talking about this yesterday on the compensatory call-in. We'll play the segment really quick. It's only like 2 minutes, and then we'll be right back to share a thought or two. Context of White Supremacy, my BFF, Amy Goodman, from a few weeks ago on Democracy Now!
I wanted to ask you about another issue, about these allegations a Russian company spent more than $100,000 buying thousands of ads that sought to politicize the U.S. electorate ahead of the 2016 presidential election. Some of the allegations relate to Russian Facebook ads specifically referencing Black Lives Matter, targeting audiences in Baltimore and Ferguson, Missouri. Meanwhile, yes. Google also says, quote, suspected Russian agents, unquote, paid for tens of thousands of dollars worth of political advertisements last year, also aimed at swaying the 2016 presidential election. Your thoughts?
First of all, we have to be really clear. This is not simply about what Russia has done. This is about how Russia and the right wing of the United States has collaborated to undermine democracy. So I want to be very clear. When we talk about, Russia buying these ads or using these Facebook pages, so on and so forth, what we're really talking about is a collusion, a collaboration between a global right wing. That's really important. We need to be really clear about that, number one. Number two, whether the ads or the Facebook pages seem to be pro or anti Black Lives Matter, the fact is that these pages and these ads were anti-Black. That's what's clear. They were using anti-Black tropes of Black militancy to sway an election and undermine democracy. This is not new. The CIA has done this for decades. This is a tactic that has been used by the United States internationally for decades. We should not be surprised that it is being used now. And we need to think very carefully about what is going to happen over the next several years to undermine the next presidential election. And we need to get ready.
I wanted to ask you about a CNN report, a social media campaign calling itself Blacktivist and linked to the Russian government used both Facebook and Twitter in an apparent attempt to amplify racial tensions during the election. Again, they attribute it to two sources with knowledge of the matter talking to CNN. The Twitter account has been handed over to Congress. The Facebook account is expected to be handed over in the coming days, was the report. Your response to Blacktivist, have you looked into this?
You know, I've heard about it. I've actually seen the page in the past. I spend a lot of time working on social media issues and looking at possibly fake pages that talk about black issues, trying to weed them out from pages that are related to real on-the-ground organizations. And what we've seen is, interestingly, while this has come to light, the Blacktivist page has come to light as being associated with this disinformation campaign, it's clear that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens of fake pages on Facebook, dozens of fake accounts on Twitter that claim to be related to some black movement, but in fact are not. What we need to be is very careful, making sure that the pages we follow, the accounts we follow, are actually connected to real organizations that are doing real work on the ground. And it's hard to do. It means that Facebook and Twitter have to take real responsibility for this kind of disinformation on their site, really do something to protect black activists who are working on their site, and differentiate between the fake pages and the real pages, because it has real consequences for black activism.
Malkia Cyril, for young people who may not be familiar with COINTELPRO, you certainly are. Can you talk about your own family experience? We have just about a minute.
Context of white supremacy, time and energy. Emphasize that on the program a lot. Use of time and energy. You have to really be mindful of how time and energy is used. Dr. John Henrik Clarke, that is one of the things that he said towards the end of his life. Nobody has an infinite amount of time. He said, knowing what I know now, I would not have allowed people to waste my time. War is being waged against black people. We cannot allow our time to be wasted. And I submit that is a major part of how the war of white supremacy is being waged, wasting non-white people's time and energy. Now, my BFF, Amy Goodman, in that segment where you have a limited amount of time, they invested about a good 3 minutes, about a good 4 minutes on this conspiracy about Russian meddling to sow racial discord during the 2016 election. This is one time that I'm very happy that I was muted while the sound clip was laughing. I was cackling. The Russians are accused of meddling to sow racial discord and spending a whopping tens of thousands of dollars on the election on these sites to sow racial discord when you had a person running for president who was saying build a wall, who called black teens a gang of wolves. Wilding, that was what it was, the New York Central Park 5 case, that these teens were wilding and he wanted to bring the death penalty back. So got a whole front page ad. This guy, while he is running for president and his opposition has referred to black people as super predators, you're accusing the Russians, people on the other side of the planet, of trying to sow racial discord. And you had black people being mauled. Did people remember that during the primaries when you were going to Trump rallies and black people were being punched and they were getting this on? But the Russians are attempting, it's absolute folly And they wasted 4 minutes to what is your I have no idea. I could be ignorant. I have been greatly victimized under the system of white supremacy. I have no idea how that relates to the Federal Bureau of Investigation has a report identifying black identity extremists as a violent threat. What does that have to do with Russians allegedly purchasing these websites? If I just am too ignorant to make that connection, help me please. But they invested 4 minutes on that, and then your family was a victim to the COINTELPRO program, a victim of the COINTELPRO program. We only got about a minute left, so as much as you want to say on that in 1 minute, I would have much rather we'll save 30 seconds for our nutty Russian conspiracy, and that way we can devote 4.5 minutes to what happened to your family. Let's get as much detail on that as possible about real victims of being identified as a black identity extremist. Another reason why I say Amy Goodman, another one. Good, kindly, well-meaning white person. Nothing could be further from the truth. One of the most dangerous arms in the system of racism, white supremacy. They have paired her with another one of the greats in white supremacy, Bill Maher. She'll be on his program. They'll have them together where it'll be two whites who are fighting the good fight, liberals, left wing, trying to bring down Trump and the oligarchy. They'll use those same type of terms too that you heard from Mr. Potage on the program. I will hush there. Do we have any comments on the segment from Democracy Now?
Yes. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
One quick point. When it comes to this, the past election and the Russia hacking everything, I don't know. It's a deeper paradigm within the system of white supremacy in terms of seeing two groups of white people fighting each other. And we were discussing this last night in our forum here that that's a fight that black people of color need to step away from it and just step back and reorganize ourselves in terms of fighting the system of white supremacy. But it's just basically two groups of white people fighting each other, and that's just something that people of non-color should, stay out of. And that's just my thoughts on it.
At minimum, following logic. We were talking about this just last night. Absolutely. Anybody else? If anybody sees the connection between the Black Identity Extremists report and then these allegations of Russian espionage, if you see that connection, you can share.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes. I definitely see. To me, it's almost like a resurrection of the Cold War. They would connect black groups to Marxism and Mao Zedong and of course ultimately communism, and use that as a pretext. So this is just, to me, just a modern refined version of the same thing. You're connecting them to the Russians, which again would just tie into that whole Cold War concept being resurrected, and black people being an insurgent population that's connected to this other country that we have these horrible historical relations with, as far as the Cold War and all the things that went along with it. So to me, that's where the connection is. It's just a modernized, refined version of that sort of tactic. Also, I think that's one thing that white supremacy has mastered, is the art of diversion of our attention, to pay attention to things that are not really important, while really important events are taking place right in front of us, but yet our attention might be diverted because we're watching Empire, or we're paying attention to some nonsense about Russia hacking the elections here, or whatever else they put in front of us, the shooting of the 500 people in Nevada. All of these things were things that were allowed to happen to take our attention away, while Donald Trump and other people who are against Donald Trump in the white war that Derek was just discussing, all of these things are taking place, and our attention is diverted. So by the time we redirect our attention in the right direction, things have already happened that are beyond our control or our ability to understand. And that's, again, further confusion. And this system, the linchpin in white supremacy, is deception and confusion. So that's really just watching it play out if your attention goes towards the wrong directive and you're not paying attention to what's really, really important. Thank you. I'll mute my line.
Indeed. Any other comments folks want to make sure they get in? Give one more chance. We should be here tomorrow. That would be Monday evening, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Robin Maynard, she should be on the program. Black female, should be joining us live from Canada to discuss her new book, Policing Black Lives, explores the history of white terrorism north of the border in Canada. Should have her on the broadcast tomorrow evening. That was a reschedule from this past week. Always enjoy speaking to Black people in different parts of the world. I think it is very, very important that we understand this is a global problem, global system. This is not something isolated to one specific spot, not something that you can run from, and that I think you begin to look at the problem that way, I think you can get a much more accurate assessment of what it means to be white for anybody, John Potash or anyone on the planet classified as white. When you see, oh, wow, the people classified as white, regardless of where they happen to be geographically, they are doing a lot of the same terroristic things to Black people wherever they happen to be. What does that mean about that racial classification? At any rate, tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Book club, we are finishing Neil Postman's Crazy Talk, Stupid Talk this Friday, last session, and then our new book will be The Wisdom of Psychopaths. Kevin Dutton, that was Dr. Rasayan, previously mentioned. He recommended that book, I believe it was 2012. He recommended that book. We were supposed to do it on the book club, and I don't know what happened. It just kept getting stalled. I think it finished second a number of times when listeners voted on what book we were going to do, but we will get that crossed off the list. I'm sure he will be happy. We might even be able to get him to give us a few thoughts to keep in mind as we read. But Kevin, that'll be not this coming Friday, but a Friday like almost 2 weeks from now. This Friday, we're finishing Crazy Talk, Stupid Talk, Neil Postman, which I have greatly enjoyed. With that, if you have questions, gripes, problems, can't find something in the archives, drop an email untiljustice@gmail.com. Untiljustice@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @untiljustice. Feel free, share the program, share the archives if you think it is constructive and would help non-white people get a better understanding of white supremacy, racism, what it is, how it works. Any final thoughts folks need to get in before we wrap things up? I would assume folks are good. Thanks kindly to all the folks who the person 8536. Did you have commentary you wanted to share?
Oh yes, hey, I'll make this quick. Oh yeah, you and all the other callers are right. There has always been this tying in with Russia and Black people who fight against white supremacy, going back to Paul Robeson. And now, mind you, the Russians were using him, as propaganda against white Americans, but if you remember the infamous meeting he had for I believe it was Congress, but he talked about how blacks wouldn't fight against Russia. And it was like, oh, how dare he say that? But the truth was, our problems weren't with Russians at the time. They were with white Americans, whether north, south, east, or west. And that's generally the case today. And then there was also this idea that the civil rights movement was communist influence. this said about Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, on and on and on. Even during the Obama campaign, if you remember, a socialist was a substitution for the N-word. So this really is not new, and it's also racist because it's like, okay, it's like for some reason black people can't think on themselves. We have to have some sort of outside white influence, which is extremely offensive. And good evening.
Appreciate that, M1. Absolutely. We talked about some of those very incidents on the broadcast before, Paul Robeson included. Anybody else have a quick comment they needed to get in, or folks satisfied? I'll assume we got everybody. Don't see any other hands that we missed. Grand. We will. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say it's interesting because I look at the situation, and M1 did a great job of discussing the fact that, you know, this whole association of counter-racist black people and groups with Russia and how far it dates back as far as Paul Robeson. And we know that it almost got him killed when they drugged him with the psychedelics at that party that was discussed a long time ago. And it just kind of reminds me of how the system of white supremacy works, in the sense that when you're associated, even if it's with another white group of white people, and they're against the more powerful white people or the other powerful white group, then you just become the expendable person in the middle, and they're just playing you off on the other group as a problem, which is kind of what happened with the war between the Revolutionary War here. You had blacks fighting for the British side. You had blacks fighting for the American side. And even with the Civil War, you had blacks that were forced to fight for the Confederacy and blacks that were fighting for the North. And again, whatever side you're placed on in regards to your position against another white group, then you're even more expendable than the members of the white group. So it just kind of brought that whole thing out, and I thought it was great that M1 discussed it that way. Thank you. I'll mute my line.
Appreciate that, Roz. If you have further commentary, compensatory call-in will be here next Saturday, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. We'll catch up on what has transpired over the last week. We'll certainly have more information about the alleged shooter, Devin Kelly, for the situation in San Antonio and all else that goes down between now and then. Thanks again for everybody who chimed in. I hope it was a constructive investment of your Sunday evening. Again, I encourage sobriety would be best under conditions of white supremacy. Drugs being used as weapons against us would also be a good reason to advocate sobriety. Racists, there's a long history of them taking advantage of, abusing a lot of non-white people, especially black people, with different poisons, narcotics, even alcohol, cigarettes, you name it. I think it would be in our best interest to preserve our brain computer so that we can think at a high level, produce solutions, new concepts to help eliminate the system of white supremacy and produce justice. I think us being sober would go a long way towards accomplishing that objective efficiently. That said, Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of white supremacy. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cal signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim. Yeah. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.